What do you think? Do bald people exist? Seriously, do they exist? Is there anyone that we could call bald? Okay, hear me out. According to my audience demographics, you probably do have a full head of hair. Obviously, you are not bald if that's the case. Now, remove a single hair from your head and look in the mirror. Surprise, you're still not bald. And if you're going to remove another one, that won't change either. Hair falls from your head all the time, and observing that, you conclude that no single hair could ever transition you to being bald. And you're right. There's no precise boundary between the bald person and the non-bald one. There's no single point when one becomes bald, and there's lots of people that are somewhere in between. Therefore, it could be helpful to look at baldness as a kind of specter. The closer one gets to the indisputable or paradigmatic example of a bald person, the more firmly the description of being bald applies. If you're somewhere in between, the description can get somewhat relative, and the closer you are to the paradigmatic example of a person with a full head of hair, the more firmly the description of having hair applies. So, the point is, we can still talk about bald people, they still exist, even though there's no fixed boundary or clear conditions on when exactly a person becomes bald. Just because the line between two things is obscured, that doesn't mean we can't meaningfully differentiate between the two. If you would think that, you would commit the Continuum Fallacy, refusing that two states are distinct simply because between them there exists a continuum of states. It's important to note this fallacy, especially in heated debates such as the ones regarding abortion. The topic is controversial, but the fact that the following examples commit the fallacy shouldn't be. Take this one. We can't determine a precise boundary between an embryo and a fully developed fetus. Therefore, it makes no ethical difference at what stage of pregnancy you have an abortion. Furthermore, there's no precise biological boundary between the embryo and an adult human. Therefore, there's no ethical difference between abortion and murder. Well, is there really no difference between an embryo and a fetus and even an adult human? That you can judge for yourself. But note that these are simply two bad arguments, but just because they're bad, that doesn't mean that what they argue for is not true. If we would reason like that, we would commit the fallacy, rejecting a position just because a particular argument for it is fallacious. It could be the case that it makes no ethical difference at what stage of development you have an abortion, and it could even be the case that it's the same as murder, but it just doesn't follow from these particular arguments. Peter Singer, just to give one example, argues that there's no ethical difference between aborting an embryo or fetus. According to him, abortion is always permissible, since fetuses are neither rational nor self-aware, and can therefore hold no preferences. According to Singer, ethics and morality are essentially tied to a being's capacity to want things. If it doesn't think and consequently has no desires, preferences, there's just nothing it would want, you can't really be unethical towards it. In this example, Singer recognizes the biological differences of the different stages of development in pregnancy. He just denies that these differences have any ethical significance. In the same way, someone who believes that there's a soul entering the body at conception could recognize the biological differences but deny that they have any ethical significance, since killing a being with a soul is always bad. Since this claim doesn't commit a fallacy, it lets us move on to the epistemological question of why we would think that there is such a thing as a soul and so on. Sneaked in some ethics for you, but I guess that is the field on which this fallacy gets committed the most. Since we are already talking about ethics, let's just examine another interesting argument. I'm not sure if interesting is the right word, but Sextus Empiricus, an ancient skeptic, argued that incest is not immoral, on the grounds that touching your mother's big toe with your little finger is not immoral, and all the rest differs only by degree. If the first thing he stated is not immoral, then nothing is immoral, according to this argument at least, but it commits the slippery slope fallacy, which is the idea that a relatively small first step leads to a chain of related events culminating in some significant, usually negative effect. It's a very similar fallacy to the continuum one, since it fails to recognize how the lack of a precise boundary doesn't render two things the same, but it's usually formulated as a causative argument in the form of, if you'll do A, you'll eventually do B, and since B is bad, don't do A. It fails to recognize that A could just not lead to B, even if you can't point out when precisely the causal link seems likely to break. Some examples of this fallacy would include: if we allow the children to choose the movie this time, they're going to expect to be able to choose the school they go to or the doctors they visit. And if we allow gay marriage, the next thing we know, people will want to marry their dogs or their cats, or what about their pigs? You get the idea. Some instances of the fallacy are very obvious, some are not. So let's just keep an eye out next time we'll talk about boundaries. We humans try to conceptualize the world, classify things like blue, red, round, bald, adult, young, and so on. And that's a useful thing to do if you want to talk about the world effectively. But when we do that, we often forget about all the shades in between. We idealize these concepts and imagine them as these fixed, precise things that are never, God forbid, ambiguous or relative. It's a convenient thought, but it's just not good enough. If we want to avoid the fallacies we talked about, we better update our view of these concepts. And hey, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you got any questions or comments, I'd be happy to have a discussion down below. If you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel, Baby Flapula, that's the name. And yeah, that's it. Bye.